This program is made possible in part by the Maryland Humanities Council and the National Endowment for the Arts.
Welcome to The Writing Life. I'm Michael Collier, and today I'm with two distinguished poets, Elizabeth Spires and Lucille Clifton, both longtime Maryland residents. And we are here today to talk about Josephine Jacobsen, one truly remarkable poet and short story writer of the 20th century. This summer, Josephine died at the age of 94 on July 9th. During her life, she published 9 volumes of poetry, 4 collections of short stories, and 3 books of criticism. She received many honors and prizes, including the Shelley Award from the Poetry Society of America, a nomination for the National Book Award, and from 1971 to 1973, she served as consultant in poetry to the Library of Congress, a position that is now the Poet Laureate of the United States. Mrs. Jacobsen lived in Baltimore most of her life and was married to Eric Jacobsen for more than 60 years. Lucille Clifton and Elizabeth Spires both knew Josephine. They were friends, also great admirers of her poetry. And I thought, as a way to begin our discussion today, to ask you to talk a little bit about your acquaintanceship and then read a poem. So, Beth, if you would begin.
Well, I got to know Josephine in the last 20 years of her life, and it was a wonderful time for her in the stress there was a lot of long overdue recognition that came her way at that point. Mm-hmm. She put together a collected poems in the crevice of time. She had a book of short stories that was from her whole life's work done. And Josephine and I worked on a book called The Instant of Knowing, which was basically all of her nonfiction pieces. It was a miscellany of essays and talks on poetry, wonderful op-ed pieces that she'd written for the Sun, Baltimore Sun, an interview. So that, it was really wonderful to get to work on that with her. I think I first met her at a reading at Goucher College in the early 80s. I was a junior faculty member, and the president had asked Josephine to come. And then gradually, over 20 years, we just got to know each other better, and there were lunches, and finally, I guess you could say, we were close friends. One of the things she said that amused me once was that she was a short-term pessimist, but a long-range optimist. And in 1998, this poem appeared in the New Yorker by Josephine. It's called Distinctions, and it's all about that. It is hard to love the pessimist, holding forth from his dank ditch, searching for woes as for Easter eggs, like Proust's butler. It is hard to love the optimist, putting his jolly mask on grief, predicting joys which never come but will be said to have done so. It is easy to love the feckless, who take the day's jerky ride without the help of theory, constantly thrown by chance, surprised by joy, surprised by woe, a constant wanderer who never triumphed in foresight, innocently astonished.
So she wrote that in the 90s?
I would imagine it was the mid-90s.
The mid-90s, yeah.
Most of the time, after she had a poem, she'd show it to the New Yorker first, and this one appeared in 1998.
Yeah. And towards the end of her life, when she was very ill, she was still writing occasionally, wasn't she? How was she making poems?
Well, she sometimes would. She got to the point where it was hard for her to type or hold a pen, but she sometimes composed in her head, and there were a couple instances of poems being dictated. We also, at one point, there was a black trunk in her room where she lived, and I went through the trunk one day and we discovered lots of things.
She didn't protest too much? They hadn't been put away
well,
for a reason?
She was so modest that she, she would say, well, I'm just not sure about this, and I would say, no, it's good, and she'd need a little bit of convincing. And of course it was good.
Yeah. Did she need much convincing to put the essays together and the lectures and occasional pieces?
No, I think she'd worked very hard on those. Some of them had appeared as pamphlets. Some of them had been published by the Library of Congress. And I think she was pleased that they finally ended up in a book.
Wonderful. Lucille, how did you get to know Josephine?
Well, I believe, like a lot of people that are dear to me and that I've known for a long time, I hardly remember when we met. But I've known her since the late 70s. Josephine was on the committee when I was selected as Poet Laureate of Maryland a long time ago. And the thing about her that has endeared her to me forever was that in those days, a person who looked like me was sort of a subcategory of American poetry and was thought of by validated poets, which at that time were traditionally academic poets, and I've never been accused of that, didn't think of what I was doing as validated poetry. And Josephine immediately welcomed me as a member of the tribe. And I think that endeared me to her so much. So we had lunches, and I went to the house, and that sort of thing. And she always acted as if I were as much a poet as she was. I like to think that's almost true. But I think that I've said on more than one occasion that I expect that if I look at a dictionary and see the word lady, it will be Josephine's picture. And she was just always such a person who valued it and valued others and understood that there were a lot of ways of being a good poet. I remember going to the Hopkins Club for dinner, which is something she did, or for lunch quite often. And she said, well, it's the Hopkins Club. At that time, I shouldn't say that the food was not wonderful at that time. Then, this is almost 30 years ago. But she was always a good friend, and I was always part of the world of poetry for Josephine, and that wasn't true of everyone, and it was true with her from the very beginning. I have a poem here.
Can I just say something? There's something about her, I think, that really sets her apart from other poets, and I think it's exactly what you're talking about. And that is, the most important thing for her was always the poetry. And it never came down to necessarily who you were, what you had accomplished. And if she could somehow fathom and sound that out in a person, that's all that really mattered.
And I think to figure out if you were or were not genuine in your calling. And she was tremendously generous. I remember once, because she was a devout woman, religious woman, Catholic, I believe. And I was talking once about, I believe, all kinds of things, and I was talking once about spirits or something. And I said, oh, Josephine, you probably don't know about this. Oh, yes. Oh, of course. Of course. There's some story that she was once pushed downstairs by a ghost or something like that. But she was what you think a poet ought to try to be. That is, generous and inclusive and living for the work rather than the renown. So it didn't matter to Josephine if she was famous, a famous poet. What mattered to her was she writing as well as she could. And that's seems to me tremendously important. This poem is the last poem of hers that appeared in the New Yorker. It appeared last fall, and she said, she didn't think it says here, that she didn't know whether it was a poem or not. Well, that's true of all of us at some point, who knows. This is called The Companions. It's interesting because she was living close to death at that time. Living close to death is not just a case of breath after breath. It is to realize that to fraternize with the Dark Prince is possible and wise, so that in the final weather When together you quit the room, though tentative and weary, you will have the enormous answer to the enormous query. I think that's wonderful.
That's marvelous.
And she dictated that poem.
That's a poem she dictated?
That's
it came to her in the middle of the night.
It feels like a poem that would come to you, that you and you dictate it out. It has that coherency and completeness, but also mystery, as if it's coming from a long way off.
She understood mystery, I think, and recognized it and validated it. We talked about that one time.
Yeah.
And that they do come to you, and
Yeah.
you accept them.
Yeah. You know, she has this marvelous statement on poetry that I thought I would read, and it's just simply statement on poetry, and it's one paragraph. It goes like this: I don't really value very highly statements from a poet in regard to her work. I can perhaps best introduce my own poetry by saying what I have not done, rather than defining what I have done. I have not involved my work with any clique, school, or other group. I have tried not to force any poem into an overall concept of how I write poetry, when it should be left to create organically its own individual style. I have not been content to repeat what I have already accomplished or to establish any stance that would limit the flexibility of discovery. I have not confused technical innovation, however desirable, with poetic originality or intensity. I have not utilized poetry as a social or political lever. I have not conceded that any subject matter, any vocabulary, any approach, or any form is in itself necessarily unsuitable to the uses of poetry. I have not tried to establish a reputation as a poet on any grounds but those of my poetry.
That's wonderful.
Yeah. What's also really interesting about it, and I think it really speaks to how she developed as a poet, is that it's really free of any kind of jargon or buzz phrases. It's all so accessible and authentic in that way.
In one of her statements about poetry, she mentions that when everybody was rhyming, I take that to be, the 1940s and 50s, she moved away from rhyme. And the poems, to me, always feel like they have a structure or backbone, even when they're in free verse. They never feel arbitrary. They always feel that there's a form there that's within that poem. She said something about poetry that I love. She described it as the curious tension between something which must be said and the inability to say it. It is as though some strange object had been discovered and there is no word for it. It must be named. Only much later does its confounded discoverer find that the anonymous newness lies not in the word, but in its use.
Yeah, once again, that sense of mystery.
And it's interesting because we talked about this at one time, that even free verse has a form. It's just might be a form we don't know or we don't recognize, but that doesn't mean it is formless. This is not a formless world.
Yeah.
I love that she accepted mystery. Being a religious woman, and oftentimes people who are seem to be much more sure, and yet it seems to me that she was more a believer because she wasn't sure.
It's wonderful. Will you read the poem, You Can Take It With You? Because I think that poem speaks to exactly what you're talking about.
I think one of the things we do in our culture is to define things very narrowly. And we define what is formal very narrowly. You can take it with you. 2 little girls who live next door to this house are on their trampoline. The window is closed, so they are soundless. The sun slants. It is going away. But now it hits full on the trampoline and the small figure at each end. Alternately, they fly up to the sun, fly and rebound, fly, are shot up, fly, are shot up, up. One comes down in the lotus position. The other, outdone, somersaults in air. Their hair flies too. Nothing can keep them down. The air sucks them up by the hair of their heads. I know all about what is happening in this city at just this moment. Every last grain of dark I conceive. But what I see now is the two little girls flung up, the sun snatching them, their mouths rounded in gasps. They are there. They fly up. Ah, that's wonderful.
It does actually encapsulate that sense of there's something dark and disturbing and pessimistic, but around it really is something that's optimistic, and the beauty and sublime aspect of experience is there to somehow not redeem us from it, but at least distract us from it. Yeah.
I've always felt that in her poetry there's this two strains or veins, joy and terror. And there's this joyous affirmation, but there's also some sort of darkness underneath.
And isn't that the mystery?
That's the mystery.
Yeah.
I have one, Mr.
Good.
Mahoney. And I guess I should put this in context in the sense that the last couple years of Josephine's life, she lived in a retirement community. And this poem is probably set in a place like that, where a lot of people are living close to death, as in the poem you read, Lucille. Mr. Mahoney. Illicitly, Mr. Mahoney roams. They have him in a room, but it is not his. Though he has become confused, it is not in this. Mr. Mahoney cannot find his room. A young blonde nurse gentles him by the elbow. I hear her again in the hall. Mr. Mahoney, this isn't your room. Let's go back and see if you've brushed your teeth. Yours is 8:20. Why brushing his teeth is the lure, I cannot say. Does he prize it so? She darts on white feet to spear him from strange doors. I hear her repeat with an angel's patience, yours is down this way. But 8:20 is a swamp, a blasted heath. A dozen times returned, he knows it is wrong. There is a room in which he does belong. He has been to 8:20. He has brushed his teeth. Before his biopsy, the harried nurses attest, Mr. Mahoney was tractable in 8:20, though very old and brown. He will have to go. This is not the hall, not the building for his quest. Tranquilized, Mr. Mahoney still eludes. At 2 a.m., in my dark 283, the wide door cracks, and sudden and silently, Mr. Mahoney's nutty face obtrudes. It is gently snatched back by someone behind it. That is someone else's room. Yours is this way, Mr. Mahoney. He could not possibly stay. He is gone by noon. He did not have time to find it.
It's a wonderful poem. I love that moment, which she describes as nutty face.
And the poem is absolutely lucid, although it's about someone who's not lucid at all.
Yeah.
But I mean, it's kind of one of the things that interests me about it.
She started writing very young, at a very young age, like 9 or 10. And once you know that, you also understand that there's a sort of fated aspect to her being a poet, and almost born into it. And she talked about that. She liked to talk about how it chose her. Yeah.
Stanley Kunitz's famous quote, "I did not choose the path chose me."
Yeah.
Well, and she talked in one or two autobiographical essays about the experience of publishing her first poem in St. Nicholas magazine, which was a children's magazine, and she was probably 10 years old and waiting for that issue of St. Nicholas. She was living in New York City, and she, it's wonderful reading it because she experienced that thrill of first publication, and she said nothing could ever equal it.
Beth and Lucille, thank you very much. It's been a real pleasure
Thank you.
talking with you about Josephine Jacobsen. And now we'll watch some clips of Josephine Jacobsen reading her poems.
I think it was Wallace Stevens who said, and I'm sure quoting from memory, I'm quoting incorrectly, "It lies in the sun, its head is on its paws, it could kill a man." And that is the way that I feel about poetry. The next poem I want to read is a poem called When the Five Prominent Poets. And this was written, I have a feeling that the muse of poetry is a very ferocious muse. I think it was Wallace Stevens who said, and I'm sure quoting from memory, I'm quoting incorrectly, "It lies in the sun, its head is on its paws, it could kill a man." And that is the way that I feel about poetry. And I think we've all at one time or another, willingly or unwillingly, been part of little groups of poets who get together to admire each other and to talk about the muse and to, with much mutual congratulation. And I've often wondered if it isn't a fairly cozy little enclave that might be very, very alarmed if the muse arrived. And this is called When the Five Prominent Poets. When the five prominent poets gathered in inter-admiration in a small hotel room to listen to each other, like Madame Verdurin made ill by ecstasy, they dropped the muse's name. Who came? It was awful. The door in shivers and a path plowed like a twister through everything. Eyeballs and fingers littered that room. When the floor exploded, the ceiling parted, and the muse went on and up, and not a sound came from the savage carpet. That poem was translated into German last year by a professor from Oxford University who read it in a lecture in Germany on American poetry, and he sent me a copy of it in German, and it was simply marvelous. The muse in German was ferocious beyond the sounds, the sounds going through that room. Oh, I thought that's what it should have been written in the first place. I would like to read the title poem from the Chinese Insomniacs. I've been very, very much concerned with time, with poems with time lately. There's a whole section in this book which really basically deals with time. And I discovered a couple of years, 2 or 3 years ago, that I really didn't believe in time anymore. That's a quite literal thing, or at least I was aware that chronological time by which we function and which is absolutely necessary for us in our daily lives really is so elastic, is so unpredictable, is so unreal, that there is that chronological time, and then there is the real time about which we know almost nothing. And I think that anyone who has been caught up in a great happiness will know that an hour is lost. It's simply lost. And anyone who has sat outside a hospital room, perhaps, as an example, waiting for word of someone whom they love for an hour, knows that that hour has no relation to the hour by the clock. It is simply a fact, I think. And I think also that that means that time, in the sense of death and the people who have gone before us, really is not that real. I think we have an association with Li Po or John Keats or many, many other people which perhaps is closer in a real, very real sense than the majority of the people that we casually brush against in life. They're really closer, I believe. And this tries to say something about that. The Chinese poets seem to have been tremendously insomniac, and this goes straight to my heart as a fellow in that club. And they always seem to have been writing poems about not being able to sleep and about turning at night and looking out at the moon, and that seems to have been the focal point of their poetry. And this is called The Chinese Insomniacs. It is good to know the Chinese insomniacs, how in 495 AD, in 500 BC, the moon shining and the pine trees shining back at it, a poet had to walk to the window. It is companionable to remember my fellow who was unable to sleep because of a sorrow or not, who had to watch for the wind to stir night flowers in the garden instead of making the deep journey. They live 900 years apart and turn restless, She says her sleeve is wet with tears. He says something difficult to forget, like music counts the heartbeat. A date is only a mark on paper. It has little to do with what is long. It is good to have their company tonight. A lady awake until birdsong. A gentleman who made poems later out of fragments of the dark. And then I'd like to end by reading a poem from the selected poems. I think one of the things that perhaps has never been expressed, as so few great moments of happiness can be expressed, is what happens to one when one is reading a truly great poem. I know of no words to express it. I think a poem by Christopher Marlowe expresses more closely to me than any poem that I've ever read, but he says, and again I'm going to misquote, "Still would there linger in their restless heads one shape, one shade, one something at the least, which into words no virtue can digest." And that beautiful poem. I shouldn't have quoted that before reading this, but anyway. This is called Gentle Reader, and it is about the experience of reading a great poem. Late in the night, when I should be asleep, under the city stars in a small room, I read a poet. A poet, not a versifier, not a hotshot ethic monger laying about him, not a diary of lying about in cruel, cruel beds crying. A poet, dangerous and steep. Oh God, it peels me, juices me like a press. This poetry drinks me, eats me, gut and marrow,
until I exist in its jest of sorrow, until my juices feed a savage sight that runs along the lines bright as beasts' eyes. The rubble splays to dust, city, book, bed, leaving my ears lust, saying like Molly, yes, 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 oh yes.